get real quiet in here. I have a feeling we're going to start pretty soon. I guess that means I get an extra 5 minutes for class, right? We'll see. I had a teacher that used to tell me the bell doesn't dismiss you, I dismiss you, but I won't do that this morning. Well, the bell should be ringing here any minute, so I guess we'll just go ahead and get started. It's good to see everybody this morning. This morning we're going to be talking about whispering and backbiting. We're going to be delving into the Word and learning a little bit more about that. Just a few housekeeping items here just before we get started. With the ice storm that we had last week, Craig and I kind of moved a few things around. So I'm going to be covering class obviously this morning and Wednesday. But next Sunday, Craig's actually going to take my spot. Craig's going to be teaching on sinful silence next Sunday since he wasn't able to cover that previously. So he'll take next Sunday's slot, and then I'll finish us up on that last class, Wednesday the 11th. So if you're going off the syllabus, it's a little different now, but bear with us. It will all be worth it, I promise. All right, so before we get started this morning, Terry, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Do you mind leading us in prayer?
Let's pray. Holy Father in heaven, we're so thankful, Lord, for today, another day of life, and for this occasion where we can come together and study your word. We ask you to be with Caleb this morning and be with us, open our hearts and minds to what he has prepared. And we pray for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Terry. All right, so just to get started here, let's just get the ball rolling here. When I use the words whispering and backbiting, what do I mean by that? Define that for me. When I say whispering, am I referring to the volume in which I'm speaking? What do you think? Are they the same? Are they different? Doug?
Well, they're pretty much the same. It's basically, in both cases, it's talking behind somebody, talking about somebody behind their back, saying things about them to others that you wouldn't say to their face.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone else? Okay, well, good thing you're all here this morning then, because we'll talk about it. We're going to learn more about it. So Doug covered it pretty well. So the important thing to understand here is they're both pretty synonymous, but the big thing here is that both of these ideas of it being done in secret. Typically, the person that is being accused or talked about is typically not aware of what's going on. In fact, so for whispering, the Greek word that's been used throughout the Bible in some ways translates to secret slander. The Hebrew word, you'll hear phrases like, in some translations, you'll hear talebearer or scandal monger. That's an interesting word. I like that word. So we may just use scandal monger for the rest of class. But also, what's another word that you probably hear more often in today's language? Gossip. Yes, exactly. Okay, so when you hear me say gossip, it's synonymous. So I'm going to use gossip just for the sake of simplicity, so we're all understand here. So again, it's this idea of secretly repeating a matter, but it's also, gossip is kind of distinguished from just sharing information, and I think in two ways especially. So one of them is the intent, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in class, but also it has to do with the type of information that's shared. So typically, when someone is gossiping, what sort of information are they sharing?
Information to tear down, information, it's not something that you usually go behind somebody's back and talk about how good they are.
Yeah, information to tear down. What else? What other kind of information?
Personal or private?
Yes, personal or private, exactly. So a lot of times when people share stuff with you in confidence, typically the idea is that they don't want you going around sharing it. Otherwise, they would have never told you in the first place. So good. So that's all about the type of information as well. And then again, with backbiting as well, the Greek word that was there, you also hear defamation or evil speaking. In the Hebrew, there's a word there that's translated also, again, secretly or secret or covert. In some cases, you'll also hear the word disguise. So let's look at a few passages here of things that the Bible has to say about this topic. So Psalm 34 and verse 13 says, "Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit." Psalms 101 and verse 5 says, "Whoever slanders his neighbor secretly, I will destroy. Whoever has a haughty look and an arrogant heart, I will not endure." Proverbs 11:13 says, "Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in spirit keeps a thing covered." Proverbs 16:28 says, "A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends." Again, Proverbs 20 and verse 19 says, "Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, therefore do not associate with a simple babbler." You know, honestly, as I've been studying for these topics, I almost feel like the book of Proverbs was written for the Sins of the Tongues class, because there's a lot of good stuff there in Proverbs that talks about the way our speech is. And again, I think it's actually kind of nice that, you know, Brother King talked about some of those things this morning about the words and just how powerful they are and the impact that they have. Because, I mean, that's the whole reason why we have this class. It's the whole reason why Craig and I have spent all these weeks talking about it, is because our tongue has such power. Let's continue looking at some more verses here. Romans 1:29 through 32 tells us, "They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them." Ephesians 4:29, as Brother King alluded to this morning, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." And James 4:11 tells us, "Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge." Okay, so we've been looking here at several passages, and rather than kind of just going through and talking about some biblical examples of things that we might see in the Bible, I want to jump just straight into some modern examples. So when we talk about gossip, what does that kind of look like in today's world? Mm-hmm. Yeah, gossip's everywhere. You see it on the internet. Good. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, speculating creates a lot of problems, doesn't it? And that idea of promulgating information that, first of all, is not confirmed by you directly. Again, it kind of goes back to that idea of, like, we kind of share it because we want it to be true. Doug, do you have something?
Yeah, a lot of times, in fact, probably most of the time, what's spread around about people is false or mostly false. But it doesn't have to be false to fall into this category. If your purpose is to tear the person down, even if it's true, you know something about this person that others don't know, but you're going to spread it around. I like the passage over in Matthew 18, starting in verse 15. It says, "Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Then if he doesn't hear you, you take 2 or 3 with you to establish every fact. You won't hear them, you tell it to the church." Too often, somebody does something against you, and you go to somebody else and start talking about it. And that's wrong. This clearly says, go to him, tell him.
Yeah, I mean, how often do you see examples within the church perhaps discussing, talking about either someone in the church or maybe a leader of the church, and you go about talking about grievances or gripes that you may have about that particular person, but rather than going to them directly, as Doug alluded to in Matthew 18, which we're commanded to, it becomes pretty easy for us to just go about and start talking with other groups about it, right? Especially those of us who may agree with of our gripes or whatever. Was there a hand over here? No? Okay. Another thing interesting, Doug, that pointed out is, like, the thing about gossip is it's not necessarily has to be information shared that's untrue. A lot of times, again, with gossip, something that's important to understand is it can be information that's true, but it's information that's shared to you in confidence, in secret, right, that was not meant to be shared. So that's another important distinguishing factor there to be made. Good. What other examples that you see in the world of gossip, what that might look like? Because it comes in many shapes and sizes. So no one has ever seen any type of gossip. Good. Yes, ma'am.
I don't even think it needs to be negative or to tear down. It's just the fact that you know that was shared with you that you think is dramatic or exciting, or simply the fact that you know and nobody else knows gives you that dopamine hit to want to share it, which is great.
I'm glad you mentioned the dopamine hit because that's a good teaser for later in the class. Good, but okay. So typically if someone begins a sentence with, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but that's an immediate red flag that gossip is probably going to ensue. So that's a good point. And again, as Megan alluded to, it doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. It's just purely something that you have no permission or you're not at liberty to share. Good. Anyone else? Yes.
A lot of this goes on in the workplace, and it can cause a lot of problems within a team, especially if you don't know what's going on, and you're like, what's going on? And then you find out later that there's been a lot of gossip going on.
Oh yeah, I mean, you hear the phrase, the water cooler talk, if we still have water coolers at work. Actually, I have one at work, but we don't really talk around it much. But yeah, I mean, the workplace is just it thrives on gossip. Drew, did you have something?
We often use the term juicy for the word gossip, and that's that same idea. There's just something that's salivating about that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit later. I mean, there are some psychological effects to both giving and receiving gossip. There's actually some mental stuff there that actually explains like why we call it. We think of it as juicy, or we're so invested in it. Good. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but this idea of like spiritual discernment, when you ever hear somebody say, I'm just concerned about person XYZ, and that usually prompts them to then lead you to share information that they're not at liberty to disclose, but they feel they're doing it out of concern for their fellow brother, which we know truly that's not really their motives. So along those lines, what are some motivations and temptations for someone to gossip? What usually motivates someone to some motivating factors?
Personal gain could be entertainment.
Yeah. Entertaining for someone. People just enjoy talking about other people. Good. What else? Yes, ma'am.
It can be, like you said earlier, I have something and I want to gather more people on my team to, make this look like it's something that's good, because look at how many of us believe this and want this to happen. So I think we have to be careful that we're not, confirmation bias, trying to get everybody on my team. So I talk to you and you don't agree with me. Yep, I don't need to talk to you anymore. So I think sometimes we do that just to try to gather up a group of, to get steam behind what I'm saying.
Yeah, it's very easy for people to fall into this misconceived idea that as long as they have the numbers on their side, it validates their argument, right? Yeah, no, exactly. And that's something we have to be careful of, especially if just because we find enough people that agree with us doesn't justify us. You got something, Jeff?
Oftentimes, it can be done to create some inequity in the relationship. So saying something about someone else takes them down a notch or two, which the thing that is intoxicating to people, the idea that's intoxicating to people is the idea that if I take this person down a notch or two, that somehow elevates me. And so it's creating, inequity between people. I'm better than you, basically.
Yeah, and that really speaks to a lot of people with their pride, right? And how they feel by tearing others down, they're exalting themselves. That's a big thing. And then along those lines as well, you have a lot of self-centeredness and insecurity. Insecurity is a very, very prevalent motivation for what can lead to gossip, because a lot of times within their lack of security within themselves, they feel the need that if they can't themselves get ahead, then their best solution is just simply, let's just bring someone down into the mud with me. Good. What are some other motivations? Jealousy? Do you want to elaborate? Because you're right.
Well, if you're jealous of where somebody is in life or their situations, sometimes your motives of tearing somebody down is because you don't like them.
Yeah, and a lot of that as well is that resentment that you kind of develop towards someone because they have something that you don't have. And it's not just enough that you want it as well, you want to make sure they don't have it. Yeah, good. What else? What are some other motivations?
I just know that there was a lot of that going around in school, when I was in school, but once I got out of school, it wasn't as much. Just sometimes friends will talk about each other. I'm like, I don't want to hear it. Don't tell me.
Yeah, and that has a lot to do with people's just natural desire to fit in, right? They want to be included. We'll talk a little bit about that again later as well. Good. Anyone else? What about, go ahead.
I think we talked about pride, but there's a sense of I have power, I have knowledge, and I'm powerful because I can spread that at will to who I think needs to hear it. And so there's a sense of power in that, and I think that's motivation for wanting to gossip.
Oh yeah, especially in today's world, a lot of times a lot of power and social currency comes from the accumulation of knowledge, right? I was actually, when I was preparing for this class, I kept thinking, and Kaylee may be able to help me out here because I'm not as much of the book nerd about it, but like Hunger Games, is it Phineas, the character that's obsessed with knowledge? I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but there's a character in the Hunger Games that he would do favors for people, but he didn't want money, he didn't want favors, he just simply wanted information on other people. Because for him, that was a big currency. Am I getting that right, or am I botching it? Finnick, okay. See, thank you. See, that's why I rely on Kaylee for book stuff. I don't read a lot of books, but that's okay. I wait for the movies to come out. But yeah, so again, to Melissa's point, information for a lot of people is a high value currency. So it's certainly important to understand that. What about fear? Does fear ever play a factor in gossip? Doug's kind of saying maybe.
Could, but
Maybe.
probably that's usually one of the lesser reasons for it.
True. Yeah, I mean, but think about it like this. I mean, people fear what they can't control, right? So perhaps if there's someone in the workplace who is elevating themselves and climbing the ladder, and you worry because if that person's in a position of power, you don't have the control over that person. You're intimidated by that person. So it could become pretty easy to figure out a means or a method to bring him down a notch. So there's something like that. We talked about it a little bit earlier, kind of sort of in line with the idea of Matthew 18, of people, perhaps they lack the courage to have a direct confrontation with the person that they have a gripe with. So there could be some cowardice there as well. Just the idea of lacking courage or maturity, being willing to speak with that person directly. Again, it's very easy for us to talk around people rather than talking to people. So that's something to look at. Let me throw this at you. What about idleness? Would idleness or laziness ever play a part in gossip? I'm seeing some head shake. Doug?
Well, yeah, that's what the younger widows were told to marry, rather because they learned to be idle and a gossip.
That's right. Doug was looking at my notes again. Very good. 1 Timothy 5:13, Paul told Timothy, besides that, they learned to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So again, as Doug alluded to, this context here is Paul was actually talking to Timothy about the young widows there. And so obviously this is not saying gossip is exclusive to young widows, but this same principle can apply to anyone who may not be productive or have something better to do with their time. So that's something to be mindful of as well. Let me ask you this. What are some temptations? We've kind of been talking about motivations, but what are some temptations for gossip? Why it may seem like gossip's kind of an easy thing to do. What are some temptations? Yes.
Just knowing something, right? I mean, if you know something and other people don't know, you're going to be continually struggling to make sure that you don't reveal that, especially if the topic comes up.
Yeah, I kind of am in that way sometimes where someone tells me something, and it's not necessarily a bad thing or anything, but a lot of times it's like, oh, I can't wait to tell other people, but they're like, don't tell anyone just yet, just wait. Or like if someone's got a surprise party, you got to sit on that for a couple weeks. That's hard. That is hard. But this is kind of more so to malicious things like that. But you're right. I mean, people like to know that, first of all, they know the information, and then they also just can't stand the fact that they don't get to tell other people about it. So a lot of times it can be easy to just say, all right, I'm going to tell this person. Good. What are some other, yes?
Well, you just said easy, and I think that's always a temptation for us as humans. If something's easy, we find ourselves rationalizing why we should just do it. And it's never been easier in human history to spread information through all of the various channels that we have at our disposal. Texting, social media, and the internet. I mean, you don't even have to talk to somebody in person, and you can spread information, and the ease of it can be tempting.
Yeah, and especially the big thing now is anonymity. I mean, that is a huge thing now. That's a big temptation with gossip as well, is the fact that you really can, a lot of times, do it in sort of an anonymous, in a lot of ways, and secretive, obviously, because that's the whole point of gossip. How easy is it to be able to attack someone with little fear of retaliation, or actually, perhaps that person that you're gossiping about, they may never actually even know that you're the one spreading that information. Because usually by the time that they discover that the word's going around, they don't know who started it. And at that point, so many people know about it that typically you can't really trace it back to the source. It's kind of difficult to do in the first place. So a lot of people understand that it's very easy for them to start something, and then by the time it's kind of discovered and it's come to fruition, it's kind of too late at that point for them to get discovered. So, and for them, they can also inflict a lot more damage to a person in secret with very little consequences to themselves. Good. Is there anything else? Yeah, Doug.
One thing about gossip, I think that causes people to do it, is they don't look upon it as being that bad. You know, it's not like some of these other sins. It's just not that bad. It's just a, you might, they don't look upon it that way. But when you read over in 2 Peter chapter 4, beginning with verse 15, I always like some of these groupings of sins that are listed in the Bible. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, or an evildoer, or a busybody in other men's matters.
Yeah.
You know, those first three we say, oh, those are really bad sins. But sometimes we don't look upon that fourth one as being that bad.
Yeah, so long as what you're doing falls in the lower tier, you're okay, right? Yeah, I mean, that's the misconception that people can and a lot of times they may think to themselves, like, I mean, what's the harm in other people knowing, right? I mean, as long as we're not maliciously talking about it, right? But of course, that's them deceiving themselves. Yes.
I think one thing too with gossip is almost always when somebody starts to gossip, there's a grain of truth in it. It's not like generally gossip among people you know, it's not going to be something that's completely crazy and made up. There's always some little grain of truth. Like you said, somebody told me something and maybe it's not right. Or maybe I saw you out lunch with a woman and I'm like, oh my goodness, I saw Caleb out with a woman. I don't know if it's your boss or not, but I've said, put the little grain of truth and set these things in motion.
Yeah, a lot of times, you're absolutely right. A lot of times gossip is correct. It's actually truthful, because a lot of times if you have a reputation of being the boy who cried wolf, most people won't listen to you. But with this idea of gossip, with it being truthful, it's very easy for that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, speculation can be very dangerous, especially when you simply are just sharing an information. So back to your point, you're like, I saw Caleb at a restaurant with a woman that was not Kaylee. And somebody says, well, I wonder why that is. And you say, I don't know. It could be someone he's seeing secretly, but I don't know, right? But as long as you caveat with the idea of, I don't know, as long as if you speculate, but you say, I don't know, then in your mind you're doing okay. But really, just by that speculation alone, you've already planted that seed of doubt within a person, right? So that's something we have to be very careful of, just sharing information, especially if we don't have that confirmation of what really is going on. Good. Okay, so what are some dangers with gossip? I mean, obviously it's a very, very important issue, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it. So what are some of those dangers that we can run into with gossip? Right, ruining reputations, right? And a lot of times it's irreparable damage. Yeah, Kaylee, do you have something? Yeah, I like how you said that, talked about not only hurting the other person, but you also can hurt yourself, right? A lot of times the danger for a gossiper directly, that person themselves, could lull themselves into this false sense of security that they may not have any sort of consequences for their actions. So Matthew 12:36 says, I tell you that on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. So while you may not face physical repercussions here for the things that you've said, understand that there ultimately you will be accounted for in the things that you've said. Patrick, do you have your hand up?
Gossip is inherently unfair because the one being gossiped against does not have a chance to defend themselves, to give context to whatever it is that's being spread around. And I think that's one of the reasons in Matthew 18, he says, go to your brother that you have a problem with, just the two of you alone. Because whatever it is that your brother did, maybe there's a good reason for it, maybe you simply didn't understand what happened. And if the two of you get together and resolve that, it doesn't need to go any further than that.
Yeah.
But if somebody starts saying, well, so-and-so did this to me and said this and so forth, and he never has a chance to defend himself, then it's just inherently unfair.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff can be cleared up with context, right? So again, that point of not allowing, as Patrick was saying, not allowing someone to first explain for themselves, because there's always two sides to a story. So that's important. Doug?
One other thought, we keep talking about the person that gossips, but it takes more than one person for gossip. It takes a listener, maybe several listeners. And the person that will sit there and listen to the gossip, to me, it's as bad as the one that's gossiping. You know, you need to say, hey, no. I think I would say, if somebody said, well, hey, I need to tell you something, but you can't pass it on to anybody else, say, well, I'm a blabbermouth, so don't tell me.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said it. I'm actually going to put a pin in what you're saying because we're going to talk about that later as well, because that's very important to understand that it takes two in all of this. Very good. What are some other dangers? Terry?
It saddens God, makes God sad.
Yeah, it has a great impact on him. Also, just because, especially in the church, just think of how much division it can cause, right? And the thing to understand with gossip is that the effects, they spread in sort of a subtle way, but they move very quickly. And a lot of times when you're unable to address it, kind of the analogy I had in mind is like when someone first kind of sows those seeds and they plant the seeds of doubt or gossip about someone, a lot of times it's not really until that seed has really germinated and reached fruition that we understand what's going on. And by then, it's too late. So that's something to understand. Travis, do you have your hand up?
Somewhat what Terry was saying, I think at its base, gossip is very manipulative. Either, as you already brought up, in an effort to make ourselves look better, or in today's actors, control the narrative. Somebody else is going to say something, so I need to beat them to the punch of my side of it. And we're trying to control things that we don't need to worry about.
Yeah, that's the thing about gossip is a lot of times you're the one taking the initiative, so you're the one that you get to frame the narrative however you want. Doug?
To me, the biggest danger of gossip is it can cause you to lose your soul. And it can cause others to lose their soul, listeners, and maybe the person you're gossiping about. It discourages them to the point that they leave the Lord.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell with especially like in the workplace or within the church, when gossip is running rampant, a lot of the time that trust erodes to a point where if I feel as if I can't even go to anyone with any sort of troubles or struggles that I may be having in life, if I don't feel safe and secure knowing that I can talk to someone at church without 60 other people finding out about it, just think of how dangerous that can be. That's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. Was there a hand? I saw a hand. No, I didn't. Okay. What about the flow of information as far as the danger? I mean, when you go about gossiping, do you really have control over the flow of information? I mean, just think, how easy is it for you? First of all, typically how it starts is say, you tell the gossip, and you say, but you cannot tell a soul, I told you this, right? And that works every time, right? Yeah. No, it never works that way. Because what happens is you tell that person you can't tell a soul. Well, that person tells 3 other people that they can't tell a soul. Well, next thing you know, those 3 people have told 3 more people. And so the thing to understand here is that a lot of times you cannot control the flow of information as well. And because, of course, we all know that one person, whether it's at work or in the family, we know that we can't tell them anything because there's a less than 0% chance they're going to keep it to themselves. So we have to be mindful of that as well. And I think a lot of times people ignorantly know that there may be people that they know that I'm going to tell them, don't tell anyone. But I know in reality they're actually going to continue to tell more people. And so then in some ways you can deceive yourself saying, well, I only told one person and I told them not to tell anyone. So I'm not the one gossiping. They were the ones spreading it. So that's kind of that misconception that people can fall into. What else? Are there any other sort of dangers that we can run into with gossip? Yes. Oh, yeah. Right, yeah. That's important to understand because a lot of times the things that you hear from the first person won't be the same information from the 5th person. Yeah, good. Okay, so we've talked about a little bit about some of the dangers of gossip, but what are some of the reasons why gossip may be difficult to overcome in the first place? Because, I mean, we've kind of mentioned to it a little bit. A lot of times it seems like gossip is sort of that easy button, right? What are some difficulties that we may have in overcoming gossip?
Sometimes when you hear something, maybe it's good news, but you want to be the one to tell somebody else before they hear it from somebody else.
Yeah, it's that idea that we want to be the ones to share the good news, and we like having that information, and we also like being part of that group. And it kind of goes back to that point of gossip in a sense is kind of tied to an identity that we have as a person. So we've talked about it before. People desire to be relevant. They want to be included and they seek approval from others. And a lot of times people may even feel validated when they become known as kind of the person that knows the scoop. I mean, we all know that person maybe at the workplace. It's like somehow they know everything about everyone, right? So if you want the hot goss, you go to that person at work. And in a lot of cases, that person does feel that sort of sense of identity and validation within themselves because they're the guy that knows everything, right? And it makes them feel important and influential. And we talked about it a little bit as well. Not participating in gossip in some cases makes you feel like you're kind of missing out. You're missing out on that social currency. So we all want to be a part of it. Patrick, did you have any? Okay. What else? What are some other difficulties that we may have?
It can be addictive.
Yeah.
Dopamine rush, right? Not having that information. And so it can be an addictive thing to some people.
Good. I'm glad you said that because that's a good segue into some of the points here I actually had written down. I want to read it I don't want to do a disservice here. But there was actually a study done to observe the effects of gossip. And a few things that they discovered was that gossip actually activates brain reward pathways. It triggers activities in parts of the brain associated with reward networks, similar to how the brain responds to curiosity and pleasurable information. And that includes signals linked to, as Megan referred to, dopamine-related processing. And this kind of helps explain why gossip can feel intrinsically rewarding. It was also noticed that people remember gossip more and engage with it more. So that same study found that people both remembered gossip better and have stronger neural responses to gossip rather than just neutral social information that they may have received. This suggests that gossip both sticks in our minds and engages our attention in a way that encourages repetition, which is kind of a hallmark of habit-forming behaviors. And then one other thing as well is, so we've been kind of talking about it often, but gossip involves social bonding chemicals. So there was a separate research thing that was done, and it indicated that social interactions, so including gossip, can increase levels of oxytocin, that hormone linked to bonding and trust. So again, it's very easy for people to gossip as to feel part of the group. And again, so as Craig was alluding to, gossip can be very addictive. And if you think about it, I mean, that's how That's how society makes a lot of money today. If you think about it, Proverbs 26:22 tells us that the words of a whisperer are like a delicious morsels. They go down into the inner parts of the body. So the reason why gossip is so hard to overcome and it's so prevalent in society is because a lot of people love gossip. They may not be the ones actually directly gossiping, but as Doug alluded to, it takes two people to be a part of that gossip. So you may not be the one actually spreading the information, but you're just as complicit when you consume all that information. I mean, think about it like this. If it weren't for the fact that so many people love gossip, People Magazine, Us Weekly, and TMZ probably would have filed for bankruptcy by now. But we understand that that's how they make their living, is just purely spreading gossip. I mean, we all really have to know how Angelina Jolie and her fifth husband are doing now. It's very important that we all understand and learn about that. But people just consume it on a daily basis, and a lot of times it's intoxicating for people, just consuming all that knowledge about people that, frankly, we have no business knowing about. What are some other dangers, or some things that are difficult to overcome in gossip? Patrick?
I was going back to dangers, but and maybe it's not gossip so much as backbiting and grumbling. It can be faction forming. Getting back to something that Paul said just a little bit before. If you got a complaint, you need to talk to somebody that can actually do something about it, as opposed to somebody who can't. And the grumbling and the complaining and the backbiting can lead to faction forming.
Yeah, it's very easy. It's easy for us to talk about others rather than confronting them directly. Or sometimes it's easier to just gossip rather than forgiving someone or even letting something go. And I mentioned this earlier, but we like to talk around people rather than talking to people. Doug, do you have something?
Just overcoming gossip, just apply the scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Ask yourself this question. If the situation were reversed, would you want each person revealing this about you?
Yeah.
You're about to reveal about them?
Yeah, really, that's kind of what it boils down to, is if we have that kind of love for both those that we're close with, those that we love, as well as even our enemies, if there's love for those people, then there's not going to be room in your heart for that kind of evil speaking towards one another. Good. What else? Yes, ma'am.
Just sometimes, like, when you hear a talking, it catch a little bit of what it is. You don't want to be the one left in the dark. You want to know what's going on. And then that can lead to gossip. But that's kind of, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, people don't like being left out, and especially when they don't understand. So they think if they consume the knowledge or what's going around, and that if they have closure and clarity on what's going on, then that'll somehow make things better, right? And again, it all goes down to just the idea of wanting to be included, right? People don't like being left out. Good. Also, one thing that can be difficult is this idea that people maybe in their minds convince themselves that what they're doing is simply just sharing information, right? They think that they're actually doing it out of a concern for the person that they're referring to. How often do you hear the phrase, "I'm just concerned about person XYZ," because they're really going through whatever that may be. And a lot of times in their mind, they may tell themselves externally that they're doing it out of a concern for someone, but really they understand that that's not their intention. They're really just there just to spread that information because they want others to know about it. Also, again, it gives ourselves a sense of moral superiority. How often do you hear gossip and you use it in a comparative fashion thinking, well, those things, at least I'm not doing what so-and-so's doing. So a lot of times it's a way to make yourself feel a little better. Did you have something, Ariel? Yeah, and I think to kind of sort of touch on your question there, especially in 1 Corinthians, I believe it was it was Chloe that had been reporting some stuff to Paul. So I think, again, not trying to totally, because I mean, I wasn't there at the church at the time, so I won't understand the full context of that, because again, we're reading somebody else's mail, right? So to that point, I will say that some of those things were of a public nature, that it was apparent, there in the church in Corinth. It was public knowledge, and people were seeing it firsthand of the sexual immorality going on. So I think kind of the differentiating factor is this idea of, with gossip, it's more so information being shared that, first of all, is not being, you're not at liberty to disclose that information about someone. But again, we talked about this idea that if there is sin going on within the church, and maybe if it is of a private nature, we talk about with Matthew 18, that command that we have for people to first address it with that brother in particular. But there are instances where maybe you have approached that brother in private, and it was not received well, and they refused to repent. But in Titus 3, we were told here in Titus 3:10-11 that as for a person who stirs up division after warning him once and then twice, having nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is warped and sinful, he is self-condemned. So there may be instances where people have been spoken to several times, both by the individual and maybe even the leaders of the congregation, if they're unwilling to repent. We talked about, as you alluded to 1 Corinthians 5, there's also passages that we're told that, skipping down to verse 13 there, God judges those outside, purge the evil person from among you. So at a certain point, if they're unwilling to repent, it is an obligation there of the church that perhaps if they're unwilling to repent, we need to remove them, right? So that's kind of the point. Jeff?
It's a really great question, and I think one that we should be asking ourselves. How do we properly distinguish between information and gossip? That's in the form of information, and it does require wisdom and discernment. Fundamentally, it's a simplistic answer, but fundamentally it comes down to motive and intent. What is the motive? What is the intent behind giving a report? And that's a matter of the heart, and it can't always be explicitly known. So it's something that we have to train our hearts to do when we're giving or receiving information. What is the motive? What is my motive? And what is my intent?
Right. So intent is a big differentiating factor of that. And again, as Doug alluded to earlier in class, if we have the proper heart and we have that proper love for our brother, that can be an issue, because again, we'll never be able to control our tongue until we're able to first control our heart, right? Matthew 12:34-35 says, "You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil." So again, that's the idea that the tongue is a direct correlation to how our heart is, and so we have to be mindful of that. So we only have a couple minutes here real quick. So just some other things. We kind of touched about it a little bit, so ways we can avoid gossip. First of all, again, as we alluded to, it's not just the person spreading the gossip that's the issue. There are also those who consume the gossip as well, can be complicit in it as well. So one of the best ways to avoid gossip is we need to first disassociate ourselves from those who gossip. So much like I mentioned when we were talking about slander, what's the best way to put out a fire? It's to deprive it of oxygen, right? So by disassociating ourselves from that gossip, eventually if you don't have an audience to hear what you have to say, it's kind of hard to spread gossip when no one wants to hear it, right? Proverbs 26:20 says, "For lack of wood the fire goes out, and where there is no whisperer, quarreling ceases." So again, that's something we need to understand. Aloto, do you have your hand up? Good. Okay. Appreciate everybody's thoughts. So I do have questions. I didn't have questions for today, but I have questions for Wednesday's class. They are printed out and they're in the back. So just grab a copy of that and be ready for Wednesday. Thank you.